Okay, we're going to start today. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really happy you're all here today. My name is Esther Feldman, and I'm here on behalf of Collabiora, which is the platform hosting today's session. We're working on making research more understandable for patients and caregivers. And before we begin, quick note, today's webinar is being recorded. If you prefer to keep your name or face private, you can turn your camera off, whatever you feel comfortable with. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions as we go in the chat or at the end by turning on your microphone. And let me quickly introduce our amazing speakers today. First, Dr. Mathew Voisin. He's a neurosurgeon scientist from Toronto and is currently completing a fellowship at Cedars-Sinai here in Los Angeles, actually. And he focuses on neurosurgical oncology. His PhD and research explores what drives brain tumor development and recurrence. In other words, he works at the intersection of surgery, science, and basically really meaningful innovation. And also, last but not least, Dr. Sanskriti Sasikumar. She's an assistant professor of neurology at UCLA, and she specializes in movement disorders. Her clinical and research work centers on treatment-resistant walking problems in people with Parkinson's disease. And she's deeply passionate about making research accessible and understandable for patients, and which is actually also why we're all here today. So thank you a lot for joining us. And yeah, let's see what our learning objectives are. I think you guys have a PowerPoint. And we can go to the next slide if possible. Yes, so today's learning objectives are actually understanding the major stages of medical research. We'll be explaining why not all discoveries become treatments and recognize how clinical trials work, and also identify where patients and caregivers can make an impact. So I would like to give the word to Dr. Mathew Voisin. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, guys, for inviting me to speak. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about medical research and preclinical research. So first, I'll give a bit of an overview about medical research in general. So medical research is a process of discovering, testing, and validating new ways that can either prevent disease, diagnose conditions, treat illness, or improve quality of life. Oftentimes, medical research and research in general is multi-purpose and wants to do, all of these things. That as you get down to, specific study or specific kind of investigation, you might have one of these that is a more major component of these four. In terms of the stages of medical research, so I'll be speaking about preclinical research, but there's really kind of four big categories. So first is preclinical, which involves lab and animal studies, and that's before any human trial. And then after that, there's clinical research, which are human trials with specific phases. Dr. Sasikumar is going to speak more about that. And then after all of that, there's kind of the, lesser known things, but still very important, the regulatory review and public access and use. And that's kind of after, there's been confirmation of a treatment or drug or, any type of research that it has benefit before it's, made available to the general public. So key players in trials, so who administers the trials and who funds the research are kind of two big questions that often can be a bit confusing to people. And so in terms of the first question, who administers the trials, so it's a combination usually of scientists, physician, and clinical trial teams. So scientists would include, non-physician scientists that often have PhDs that are doing research, and then often in conjunction with physician or physician scientists, or like myself, a surgeon scientist who want to do trials or research. And usually that's a bit more of like a translational research to try to, think of more impactful research that might benefit patients in the shorter term. And then importantly, to kind of organize and, figure out and get all of the details of these trials, preclinical and clinical, is you have all these team people, you have coordinators, patient care coordinators, lab coordinators, lab techs, and everyone that's involved kind of in doing the research and organizing that. In terms of funding, you'll have, here in America, the NIH, or National Institute of Health, is a major funding of grants. And they have, millions upon millions of dollars each year in specific grants for certain conditions or certain drugs, or there's often certain criteria that scientists and physicians can apply for to get funding. And there's other kind of funding agencies around the world that have similar types of goals, and you would apply for a grant and be funded with the grant. But then there's also a fair bit of funding that comes more privately, so specific patients, caregivers, or advocacy groups. And these would be groups or individuals, say they have a loved one that's afflicted with a certain disease and they want to raise some money or do research or a trial in that specific condition, or you have kind of a not-for-profit organization advocating for a certain condition that would fund a trial. But some of this funding can also be from companies as well, like say drug companies and things like that, that want to get a drug or a treatment to be available. And then these are kind of, all this research is regulated by specific organizations. So in America, the big one is the FDA, but there's kind of various other ones around the planet that are kind of involved in the regulation of all of this. So question, why don't all breakthroughs become treatment? So on average, only about 1 in 10 drugs that enter clinical testing end up getting approved. And there's a number of reasons for this, why every drug isn't a breakthrough. In preclinical kind of testing, there could be some safety concerns or a lack of effectiveness in humans. Something might work very well in an animal model or in cell culture, but then when it's in humans, maybe there's some safety concerns or it's less effective. And then further down the line, there might be high development costs. So again, you have to think about a drug or a treatment. Who is funding that? Is it a company that's going to be for profit? So they, ultimately want to attempt to make a profit on some of these drugs or treatments. So they need to assess the pros and cons of, how many people it might treat or how expensive it might be. For other drugs or treatments, there might be some limited funding. And that's where, there's often help with some non-company type of industries, like not-for-profit organizations. And then further along the line, there might be, more manufacturing or regulatory requirements, something that's initially passed, but then maybe is recalled, or there's further, data that shows it's not as effective as we might have thought. Preclinical research, so this is what I did my PhD research in. And basically kind of this is all research before it goes to humans. And there's kind of different areas of this. And so the goal of preclinical research is number one, to understand disease biology. Number two, to identify possible treatments that could be usually novel treatments. And number three, to test safety and early effectiveness, again, in non-human studies. And different tools used, you have cell culture, where you're, growing different cells, either, tumor cells or a certain type of cell that might grow in the human body. Animal models, where you have either mouse models, or sometimes you have other non-human primate types of models. And then a lot of work, especially recently, is with computer simulations or AI, or kind of all of these mathematical or computational models that can simulate and show, the results that you have, how effective it might be if it's extrapolated. So for my research, the goal was to understand disease biology of gliomas, which is the most common primary brain tumor. And then I use kind of a number of these things like cell culture, animal models, and computer simulations. And the goal was to try to identify possible new treatments. And so again, questions that you look at that we might think of for preclinical research. So is what causes the disease at a molecular or genetic level? Specifically, what genes or proteins are involved? How might specific cells respond to specific treatments? And are there certain pathways of, say, for example, cancer or a disease process that can be identified and targeted? And that builds scientific foundation for new therapies. So again, going back to my research where I looked at, glioma brain tumors. So what I was looking for were different genes or proteins that were involved in making a glioma, number one, occur in the first place, and number two, become aggressive, that might become resistant to treatment. So I wanted to find those specific pathways of gliomas that aren't well known. So number one, identify them, and then try to see if I could find new targets. And so there's kind of two categories of this preclinical research, basic and applied. And basic kind of focuses on just understanding, trying to figure out what's going on, what makes a glioma or a brain tumor occur. And then there's more applied research, and that's usually focused on solving a problem. So designing a drug that blocks tumor growth, or designing, some type of treatment that might, stop the tumor cells from dividing or metastasizing elsewhere in the body. And so both of these are essential for progress. And this is where usually there's a nice kind of interplay or collaboration between scientists and clinicians, where for me as a surgeon scientist, I'm kind of looking at research that's translational. So I know kind of the clinical picture from patients as well as the lab. So I'm trying to link those two things together to understand what basic research might be the most important so that it can be applied quickly and applied properly so that it can lead to novel treatments in less time. And biomarkers are an important part of this. So this is kind of a new keyword or buzzword, and these are measurable indicators of health or disease, and there's different types. So you can have a diagnostic, prognostic, or predictive biomarkers, and these help to detect or predict or identify certain patients that might benefit from specific treatments. As research and time moves on, we're beginning to understand that not every person's disease is the same, and there's very unique, either due to genetic mutations or just individualized, biology, that disease isn't all the same for every person. So if you can find a specific biomarker that can help you predict for an individual person what their disease might do in the future, that's very helpful. It can lead to specific novel treatments that can target those pathways or specific genes. What's important with all of this is to also look at the dose, toxicity, and safety testing. And so this is done, again, preclinical or before human trials, and you can determine some safe dosage ranges. You can look at side effects and toxicity, and you can evaluate how some of these new drugs or treatments might be distributed or moved through the body. And this is important sometimes to do in specific animal models in a very controlled setting, in a laboratory or in specific, populations of mice or cell culture models where you can control, very exclusively how much dose they're getting, even what temperature the cells or the animals are in, and you can figure out in a very safe and controlled way what dosages are appropriate and what side effects might be before you even begin human studies. And so then again, that's what you want to look at, and you can study some of these treatments before you move on to doses in humans. So why does drug development take so long? So kind of, I alluded to that before with all of the different steps in this process, but again, just the discovery of some of these novel treatments or targetable genes or therapies, and that's kind of what my PhD was on. That can take multiple years to find one of these targets, and then once you have a target, you need to find a drug or a treatment that targets that new biomarker that you found. Once you have that, you need to proceed to further preclinical testing, looking at the safety and efficacy of it, and then eventually you go to clinical trials in humans, where you again kind of look at the safety and the dosages and the effectiveness, and this can take years to come about before a treatment is publicly available and approved. And again, the costs of this is a big challenge. So there can be high costs with companies and funding that needs to be done. And again, a lot of research is on the forefront of technology, and so new technology is always used for some of these clinical trials. And as new technology becomes available, it's makes some research easier over time. So something that was very expensive 5 or 10 years ago might be cheaper now as research has progressed, and that can help kind of accelerate things along if you have the right equipment. But the converse is true, that if the equipment or the technology isn't there, things can take much longer as well. And then oftentimes there's a funding gap. So it's very expensive. And so you might discover something that's clinically, important and clinically relevant, but in order to get there, you need to bridge the gap before you can get to clinical testing in humans. And so that's where, usually some source of financial income is needed. So other grants, private investment, nonprofit groups, or industry partnerships, in order to make your findings a reality to advance to clinical research. Okay, I'm going to pass the slides along to Dr. Sasikumar, and she's going to talk to you about clinical research.
Okay, can you see my slides? Yeah, perfect. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for chatting about the preclinical aspect of it. I am going to be talking about clinical research in particular. So kind of getting right into it. Clinical research is a little bit different from the preclinical trials, predominantly because it really involves patients. And so while there may be some similarities between the two, the way in which it's implemented is quite different, because clinical trials tests humans. And so the goals of clinical trials include confirming safety, measuring effectiveness of an intervention, whether or not it's a drug or a particular device that's being used to treat an illness. And it also compares into these newer treatments to existing treatments that are already on the market. Typical participants include patients. They can also include healthy volunteers, as well as healthcare professionals. If, let's say, you're studying how, let's say you're trying to come up with a new clinical model, you would really want to include other health professionals in terms of implementing a newer model of providing care compared to the standard of care, which might be different from what's being innovated. So clinical trials come in different phases. So phase 1 of a clinical trial typically focuses on safety. And so the testing is done in a small group of healthy volunteers. Phase 2 studies are also studying effectiveness and safety, but with people who actually have a certain condition. It's still a smaller group. with phase 3 essentially looking at a larger group of people with a disease, but also studying perhaps the dose of the intervention that's being provided. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And phase 4 is the post-translational testing. So after it's been approved, we're looking at long-term effects of the intervention itself. And so each phase, as you can see, really answers a very different question. So phase 1 essentially asks, is it safe? So it evaluates the safety and the dosage, if it's drug related, and it studies typically about 20 to 100 people, and it looks specifically at side effects, how the body processes the drug, as well as it trying to determine a safety range of the dose. Phase 2 trials essentially are seeing if it works in the disease population. So the purpose is to test whether or not the treatment is effective. It looks at about maybe 100 to 300 people, and it focuses a lot more on treatment effectiveness, as well as still monitoring for safety in the population of interest, and trying to figure out an optimum dose of the medication that's being administered. Phase 3 trials essentially question whether or not it's better than the existing standard of care, so whether it's better than what we have. So it evaluates both safety as well as dosage, and looks at a relatively small group of people, about 20 to 100 people, and is still continuing to answer the question about side effects, how the body processes the drugs, as well as figuring out the safety range. So what happens in a clinical trial? Typically, people who want to participate are screened for eligibility, because every clinical trial has certain criteria that they're looking at in terms of the patient population that they're trying to study. The more specific we get about this question, about the eligibility criteria, the better the answers we get from the type of intervention that we're studying. So let's say you're trying to study patients with Parkinson's disease between the age of 40 and 70, and often there's certain age groups that are excluded depending on the type of intervention that's being administered. It would also be things like how many years of the disease that you've had. So let's say a patient who's had Parkinson's for at least 5 years, and other things like, let's say, if you're trying to study a newer type of medication intervention, they may have a criteria that the patient should not be on medication at the time of recruitment to the trial. So there are lots of different eligibility criteria that really select a very certain group of patients in order to participate in it. But the eligibility criteria is different in different studies. There's informed consent that's obtained, because it's important that you understand exactly what you're getting into. And during this time, people are often informed about the risks, the benefits, and if it's going to differ from their existing standard of care treatment that they receive. And so you really will have an opportunity to truly understand exactly what you're getting into during the informed consent part of it. Hold on.
Sorry to interrupt.
Stop. Hold on, let me just bring that back up.
Oh, yeah.
There. So showing up now?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
And then if appropriate to the study itself, and depending on the type of study, people will get randomized into different groups. So whether it's the treatment group or a placebo group, where essentially that they're not actually administering any intervention. And then the treatment administration, depending on what's being studied, again, this can happen at different intervals, and monitoring and follow-up, again, depending on the type of intervention, and data collection. So at different points, oftentimes when you participate in a clinical trial, you end up seeing a lot more people than your physician, and they have many different roles. So they have people who are specifically there to randomize the participants, specific people administering the treatment, and specific people involved in the data collection point of it. So you'll likely be interacting with a lot more people than your physician, and perhaps sometimes even a different physician if your treating physician is not the primary investigator in the trial. But it's important to know that at any point in any clinical trial, you always have the option to leave the trial at any point in time. You don't necessarily have to, had like an adverse event. You can just decide to leave at any point if it suits you. And essentially what happens is the data that's collected from you will just not be included in the final results. So there are different types of clinical studies. It's helpful to know this only to kind of understand what type of trials are done in, like what type of clinical trials there are. So randomized controlled trials compare a new treatment to an existing treatment or a new treatment to placebo. I mentioned that word before. Essentially, I liken it to a sugar pill. So it's not really getting a treatment per se. It's a non-intervention, and participants are often randomly assigned. And nowadays, the current way this is done is through a computer-generated number that's assigned to people. And so there's really no kind of human intervention there in terms of determining who gets what treatment. Cohort studies are studies that follow groups over a period of time. So for example, if you're looking at smokers versus non-smokers and trying to follow to see the likelihood of developing lung cancer. Case control studies essentially compare patients with and without a condition. So for example, if there's an outbreak of food poisoning, you would look at people who have and don't have food poisoning and try to trace it back to what they might have eaten or been exposed to, if it's a funky potato salad or something. So that's a kind of study that would be. And again, different trials are designed differently. These could involve treatments. They could be observational studies where people are just kind of trying to understand the constellation of events that result in a disease, or perhaps trying to observe how the condition progresses over time. Or they could be interventional studies. So like I said, either in terms of medication interventions or other types of treatment interventions. In my line of expertise, we do deep brain stimulation to study different aspects of Parkinson's disease. So let's say deep brain stimulation for memory problems in Parkinson's. That would be a new intervention. So there's devices as well that are also involved in clinical trials. And so protecting participants is a very, very, very important part of running any trial. And there are research ethics boards at every institution that runs a clinical trial. And so these boards overlook patient safety. They make sure that the informed consent is thorough and accurate and detailed, and in honestly a language simple enough for people to understand, even if they're not familiar with the condition. That fair recruitment is taking place, as well as data privacy respected. This is actually quite a long, drawn-out process. It could be there's a lot of back and forth between the scientist who's sent a proposal to the research ethics board, and so there are lots of iterations that happen before a finalized copy of the informed consent and before a finalized copy of the trial and its rules are published on websites like clinicaltrials.gov, which essentially summarize what trials are out there for people to participate in. Sorry, I think I keep cutting out with my webinar slides. It doesn't want to show it for some reason. Okay, is it back up now? All right, so and these research ethics boards, or REB for short, would include scientists, doctors, community members, and so they do have a diverse group of people that would typically be involved in a clinical trial in the first place. And so Dr. Voisin mentioned regulatory reviews. Essentially, these are boards that differ in different countries. It's the FDA here in the US, there's the European Medicines Agency, and depending on which part of the world you're in, they have different organizations that are responsible for this. But the process is still the same. These are agencies that review a lot of paperwork and a lot of data to ensure safety, quality, and effectiveness of an intervention. And they really require proof of long-term benefit before they approve a drug. But there are phase 4 trials, which essentially do assess the longer term benefit after a trial after an intervention has already reached the market. And if you get approval from a regulatory board, essentially what that means is that the benefits of the intervention outweigh the risks and that manufacturing standards are met. So there are a lot of recruitment challenges with clinical research, and often this is one of the things that tends to stall and often delay the process of discovery to implementation. And these are some of the common reasons. So the 85% clinical trials are delayed due to slow enrollment. That's still the quoted data, but the original data came from a report from 2019, which essentially looked at the different factors that delay clinical trials. And these are some of the things that were identified. Honestly, lack of awareness of clinical trials. One of the things is there's a lot of factors that play into this. Lack of patient awareness often comes from either your physician is just not involved in clinical trials, or even if you are seen at an academic center, sometimes time is also something that tends to restrict the ability to discuss this. Travel burden is another piece where a lot of clinical trials are run at academic institutes, which can be far away for a lot of people. Eligibility criteria, because as I was saying earlier, the very specific criteria that people would need to meet in order to participate in a trial, depending on the type of study that they're looking into, and time commitment. So, for example, one of the studies that I was involved in was looking at treadmill training in people with Parkinson's disease, and so that involved people coming in like 3 days a week for about 6 weeks for at least an hour. So, some of these trials can be quite cumbersome, and it can be very difficult, especially if you live far away. Or transportation can be an issue that often limits people coming in for this as well. But I think we're getting better. So as technology is improving, we're getting a little bit more innovative in terms of picking up the data that we're interested in learning. Obviously, this doesn't apply to all kinds of treatments, but can be very helpful in using, let's say, wearable devices, mobile health apps, remote monitoring, in order to essentially track different symptoms. For example, I think sleep studies were one of the big things that were a bit challenging to mimic and actually capture data from, and so we're now using things like wearable devices, watches, in order to essentially get the information that we need. And this is not only beneficial because it's helpful and easier to implement in a trial, but also it does capture more real world evidence, and it also facilitates for more inclusive research. I think this is like a whole other can of worms in terms of inclusivity in research, which we'll try to address in a webinar later on. But basically, wearables allow us to address for these issues. So patient advocacy and community impact is very important and can make a massive difference in clinical research. These organizations are involved in funding clinical trials. So again, from my line of work, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, I would apply for grants through them in order to run projects that I'm doing. They connect patients to trials. I'd mentioned clinicaltrials.gov, but the Pecori Foundation as well, and Center Watch, they essentially connect patients to trials directly and just raise awareness for that. The organizations specifically raising awareness include things like the Alzheimer's Foundation, National MS Society, and again, these organizations can also be very helpful in terms of raising the issues that are pertinent to these conditions that that we don't typically tend to study. And they also really influence research policy as well. And so these are quite powerful organizations. Some of the examples that show the impact of their work include during the HIV pandemic. It was patient advocacy and community impact that essentially facilitated the rapid discovery of antiretroviral therapy. And I guess more recently, over the COVID-19 pandemic, the symptom of long COVID is something that really came to attention through these patient advocacy organizations, trying to raise awareness that, hey, this is a real thing, you really need to study it. And so that's essentially what mobilized scientists and physicians to essentially get behind research looking into those particular issues. So a lot of breakthroughs happen from patient-led movements. So how can you get involved in clinical research? You could join clinical trials. It's always good to know about what clinical trials are going on near you, and because it's at the end of the day, it's always your decision about whether or not you want to participate in it. But some trials are observational studies, and are relatively low key in terms of the number of visits that you need to make, or the type of intervention that you would need to take as part of the trial. You could support advocacy organizations. You can either volunteer or donate to patient groups as well, that again tend to fund clinical research. You can participate in patient advisory boards. This one's a really cool one, I think, because like at my previous institution, we would actually interact a lot with our patient advisory groups in order to figure out and make sure. Sorry, I seem to have lost. Here, sorry, 1 second, let me just pull that up again. In order to essentially make sure that we were doing research that was important to people. And so like once or twice a month, we would essentially run the trials that we were doing at our center through these patient advisory groups and get their feedback on whether or not there's anything that we can be doing better with them. There we go. I think you should be able to see my slides now, right? And it's also, as I was kind of saying, staying informed about research opportunities, essentially, following research news and keeping up with trial databases. We'll try and include some of this at the end of the webinar. Sorry, I don't know why I'm getting into this.
I can try to.
At the end of the webinar, just so that just so that you know exactly where to get this from. In general, you can get information about trials and what's happening from websites regarding your disease. So example, for Parkinson's disease, the Parkinson's Foundation or the Michael J. Fox Foundation are good resources where people can actually see what's going on and what clinical trials are have happened, and basically the most up-to-date breakthrough stuff that's happening in the field. And trial databases, there are some trial databases again that we will include. Clinicaltrials.gov is one of them, just to essentially see what trials are being run around the world and what you might be eligible for. So key takeaways, essentially medical research is a long and a very collaborative process. Safety and evidence is present at every step. Not all discoveries become treatments. And it's very important to know that patients and caregivers are partners. It's a bi-directional relationship. And it's very important that we work together in order to essentially discover new treatments.
All right, Dr. Voisin, Dr. Sasikumar, thank you so much. That was incredibly clear and helpful. And that also wraps up the main part of our presentation. We will now move on to the Q&A part. So for our participants, you can drop your question into the chat or turn your microphone on and ask directly whatever you prefer. There's no pressure, and there's also no wrong questions. If you're wondering something, chances are someone else is also wondering the same questions. So let's dive in. So feel free to unmute yourself, or let me check also the chat. Okay, we have a question. Would participating affect my current treatment plan? Can one of you answer that?
I'll let you answer that, Dr. Sasikumar.
So it doesn't. It often so when you participate in a clinical trial, they do account for you getting standard of care. So again, I can just give you an example from my own work. So let's say you have Parkinson's disease and you're involved in a clinical trial looking at disease-modifying therapy, where let's say you get an infusion that essentially attempts to reverse or slow down the progression of the disease, and that's the study that you're involved in. It wouldn't mean that you have less frequent appointments with your physician. So if they're my patient, they would still see me at their regular frequency, but I would be aware that they're participating in a clinical trial, and I'll just make note of that. So what tends to happen is if I, let's say, see them and they have some side effects from some intervention that would not be typical for their condition, I would essentially keep their clinical trial team involved in my notes and in my assessment of them. And so, like, everyone is more involved. I think the only difference is that you might have a lot more appointments than you might otherwise be used to, because you'll be seeing a lot of different people. So let's say you would see me, and if I'm not the primary investigator, they would see a colleague of mine in order to just kind of follow up on like symptoms and how they're doing, and the basic standardized assessments that would take place in a trial.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. Let me see which questions we have. I think this question is also for Dr. Sasikumar. My parent has Parkinson's. How do we know if we should join a trial?
That's a very good question. I think that's a very personal decision. The way, like, I always like to inform my patients about clinical trials, and some people like kind of know well beforehand that they want to participate in clinical trials, whereas others tend to be a little bit hesitant, which is very understandable. Everyone's very different, and so often I always keep that door open. So if and when they're interested in clinical trials, like, just let me know and I'll connect you with a research coordinator. But there's no way to kind of know whether or not clinical trials are the right decision for you. It's more in some ways a bit of a curiosity and collaborative endeavor with your physician and treating team. So for example, if someone has Parkinson's disease and they have in some cases, if they have a treatment-resistant symptom that we don't have any cure for, and we're essentially maybe studying that specific symptom, like let's say memory problems, and we're doing a study on memory problems in Parkinson's disease, often that's an opportunity to get involved to see, because we're at the forefront of research. So if there is any benefit, then that might be something that they might experience. But on the other side, depending on the type of intervention, they might not experience anything at all. And so it's a very personal decision as a consequence of both your own impression of trials, but also perhaps sometimes the symptoms that you have that are, let's say, either responsive or non-responsive to the treatments that you get. I'll actually let Dr. Voisin answer this one as well, because I think in his clinical research, there's maybe some additional stuff with cancer-specific trials that would be helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of for that getting involved, I mean, usually when we see patients in the clinic, it's difficult to know exactly all of the clinical trials and things that are going on. I think that's part of what Clavior is trying to do is to be able to connect or better connect researchers with patients. And so you can have a better understanding or have time to figure out exactly what trials or options could be available. In the cancer world, and more specifically in brain tumor treatment, a lot of these, treatments, or there isn't a very good standard of care or a standard treatment for some of the tumors or disease. And so when you enter a clinical trial, often, the standard of care is kind of like not known, or there's no real treatment. And so then it might change your treatment plan, that you might actually get some type of treatment instead of getting no treatment. And whether or not that's effective, we don't know. That's why the trials are being done. But it could change your treatment plan in that aspect, that you might go from getting no treatment to some form of treatment that could or could not be effective. But it's hard because there's a lot of inclusion exclusion criteria, and sometimes it's difficult for patients and families to navigate. So I think what Clavior is trying to do is to better bridge that connection and connect people so that you can figure out what is best for you, and more specifically how it could affect the treatment plan, because it's hard for us in clinic when we see patients to spend all that time kind of speaking about that in an in-depth manner.
Thank you both for your answers. And then we have another question. Will I be compensated for my time? So if you participate in the clinical trial.
I guess I can take this one. It varies in different trials. So there are some trials that that compensate patients, either like a payment is given, or compensate for travel costs. So depending on the funds available for a clinical trial, it varies in different trials. So for example, like in the trials that I've been involved in, sometimes they've just covered travel expenses. Other times, depending on the intervention, sometimes patients would get like a certain amount of money transferred to their account. And yeah, so it varies depending on different trials, but it's an important question to ask. And I think certainly asking, if you're participating in any clinical trial, even if you ask for compensation for travel costs, if you're coming from far away, that might be something that your trial team may be able to navigate through.
Thank you. And let me see if there are any other questions.
I have a question that came up on mine. I don't know if you guys see it.
Yeah, no, I don't see any other questions. Could you read it out?
Yeah, so this question says, if I wanted to be involved from a clinical aspect from the UK, how would you suggest connecting or contacting research organizers? I might leave that up to you two to answer.
I can maybe take that. Sorry, I'm taking a lot. But basically, there are websites where you can find clinical trials in your location. I know I mentioned clinicaltrials.gov. That's actually international, and most clinical trials are registered there. The UK specifically, I think it's called the ISRTN. So it's the ISRCTN registry, where you can essentially look up clinical trial. I think that's a UK-based registry as well. So if there are certain trials not on clinicaltrials.gov, it would be on there. And you essentially would, a lot of these websites function in the same way, where you would identify what condition you have, and you can be more specific, based on location or, what age group you're in, and they kind of populate. You should get a group of trials that are being run that might be of interest to you. It would be, the thing is, these trials it's always changing. So don't be disheartened if you put in as much information as you can and you're not getting anything on your end. So this is something that you can essentially, like, the field is constantly changing. So even if you don't see a trial today, you might see one next week. So it's important to keep looking that information up. Although it might be a bit cumbersome. And in terms of contacting them, they usually have a contact information. So in that, they usually have the contact information for the research coordinator or primary investigator, and you essentially just shoot them an email saying, I'm interested in participating in the trial. Sometimes they even have phone numbers. I would recommend doing both because, again, in this day and age, never know. It's always good to just kind of maximize your opportunities to hear back. So I would send an email and contact the phone number if there is one on file. But there always is a contact person that you can reach out to for whatever clinical trial you're interested in.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's also a website called EU Clinical Trials Register, which is not in the UK, but it's still close enough if there's a clinical trial that you cannot find on the UK register. It might be on this one. It's just an additional information that you can keep in mind.
EMIC for Asia, but we'll try to put this information as well in a PDF after the webinar.
Absolutely. Are there any other questions? We have time for one more question if there is. You can also unmute your microphone if that's easier. If not, then I want to thank you all so much for your questions and for spending time with us today. We're really glad you joined. And also, if you want to stay connected with us or join future sessions like this, you can follow us at Collabiora or sign up at our website because we're currently building tools to make medical research easier to understand and easier to access. And we like to keep you in the loop, basically. We also are going to send the recording to everyone who registered, so you can rewatch anything or even share it with someone who might find it helpful, for example. And also on behalf of our speakers and the whole Collabiora team, thank you again for being here and enjoy the rest of your day and hopefully see you the next one. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.